Sky News. The full story first.
Hello, it's Deborah Haynes here, and thank you for downloading these new episodes of the Wargame. I also wanted to tell you about our one-off live event happening in London in January. The Wargame Decoded will put you in the mind of the people who took part. Some of our participants, including Sir Ben Wallace, Amber Rudd and Jack Straw, will be with me on stage to talk through the decisions they made, the pressures they felt, and we'll let you experience some of the key moments of the game for yourself. How would the UK respond in a crisis? And how prepared are we? Join us for the Wargame Decoded on January the 29th in London. The details are in the episode notes. The Wargame revealed how vulnerable the UK has become to an attack on the home front. But to understand why and what's gone wrong, it's worth taking a journey back in time.
OK, I'm Geoff Hoon. I was the Secretary of State for Defence from 1999 to 2005.
My name is John Hutton. For a year I was Defence Secretary under Gordon Brown.
So my name is Sir Liam Fox. I was Defence Secretary in the Coalition Government.
So I'm Philip Hammond.
What you're about to hear is testimony from almost every Defence Secretary since the end of the Cold War about their time in office.
My name's Gavin Williamson.
Penny Mordaunt.
I'm Ben Wallace.
Sir Grant Shapps.
Whether Labour or Conservative, these men and one woman reveal from first-hand experiences the battles that went on behind the scenes as successive governments slashed the size of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force.
John Reid, who was the Minister for the Armed Forces, and John Speller, who was one of the junior ministers in the department. The three of us went to see Tony Blair late at night. He was wearing a tracksuit, we always remember. And we said that if the money was taken out of our budget, then we would have to resign.
But, and this is really important, the truth about why the UK has been left so poorly defended is not just about investment being switched away from bombs and bullets and into peacetime priorities such as health and welfare. It's also about how well, or otherwise, military chiefs, senior civil servants and their political masters have spent what's left of the UK's still sizable defence budget. And it's not a pretty picture.
I quickly realised that we had, for whatever reason, procured 2 aircraft carriers that were neither fish nor fowl.
It all means Britain has been left to bluff as the threat from Russia re-emerges.
You know, as long as trooping the colour was happening and the red arrows flew and prime ministers could pose at NATO, everything was fine. But it wasn't fine, and the people who knew it wasn't fine was actually the Americans, but also the Russians.
Do you regret the decisions that the government took at that time when it came to what it did to defence?
Yes, I think it did cut defence too far. I mean, I'll just be completely black and white about it.
I'm Deborah Haynes from Sky News and Tortoise. This is The Wargame, Episode 6, The Ministry of Defiance. Every government since the 1990s has failed to be more honest with the public about the impact of the choices they make to spend more money on hospitals, schools and pensions at the expense of defence. Prime ministers and their cabinets have maintained that the UK, as a nuclear power, a leading member of NATO and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is still strong, even as the armed forces struggle. Grant Shapps took over from Ben Wallace as Defence Secretary in 2023 when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. Now out of office, he's refreshingly honest about the UK's dissembling.
On the honesty part of it, do you think that there's been a bit of bluffing going on here so that our enemies know how hollowed out we are? Our public doesn't.
I think I would describe it more that there's a sort of conspiracy, and I don't mean this in a conspiratorial way, I just mean in a convenience way, a convenience perhaps, of not really allowing the issue to bubble to the top of the agenda. So a conspiracy of silence, I would say, where both at any given time, the government and the opposition, although of course the opposition would always pick away a bit, but basically would keep relatively quiet on the subject, knowing that if the opposition was in power, they would want to focus the resources somewhere else.
The story of the UK's hollowed-out defences starts in a different era, when an Iron Curtain divided Europe. Ronald Reagan was President of the United States, and an Iron Lady was in power in Britain.
And it was a very constructive meeting, and I felt then that somehow I had a deep instinct that was the beginning of a quite new relationship.
So we're talking really about 1982 to 86, when I was minister at the Foreign Office under Geoffrey Howe. And relations at that time were extremely bad with the Soviet Union, pretty well as bad as they are today with Putin's Russia.
Malcolm Rifkind is a veteran Conservative politician who was first elected to Parliament back in 1974. He rose up the ranks to become Defence Secretary and then Foreign Secretary under John Major. But when I met him at his home in London, he began by talking about his time in a more junior role at the Foreign Office when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. It was December 1984, and she had agreed to host a new and relatively unknown member of the Soviet Communist Party Politburo called Mikhail Gorbachev, who of course later went on to become the last leader of the Soviet Union.
When Mrs. Thatcher made the famous remark at the end of the day, which everyone will recall, she came out saying, "I think Mr. Gorbachev is a man with whom we can do business." That was not because they had agreed on anything during their discussions. They'd agreed on virtually nothing. He was a communist, she was the Iron Lady. But two things had happened. First of all, they liked each other as persons, but much more important, they were beginning to trust each other. And she sensed correctly, as it turned out. She then tells President Reagan. Now, if it was anybody else, Reagan would have said, "I'm not going to speak to some unknown communist in the Politburo." But if the Iron Lady, who Reagan thought very highly of, if she says he's worth talking to, he must be worth it. We better get in touch with this guy, which they did. And I'm oversimplifying it, but that led to the Cold War ending without a shot being fired and the Berlin Wall coming down.
As we've discussed throughout this series, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the UK and much of Europe reaped a so-called peace dividend, cutting defence budgets, shrinking militaries, and reducing wider readiness for war.
I mean, the British Army was 150,000 strong when I joined it. It's now 72,000 or 73,000 today.
As well as defence secretaries, I've also spoken to some of the military chiefs of the past 4 decades, including General Sir Nick Carter. He rose up the ranks to become head of the army from 2014 to 2018, and then Chief of the Defence Staff, or CDS, from 2018 until 2021. What does it make you feel when you've got the Prime Minister now talking about, deploying as part of an international force to Ukraine, and our actual ability, the UK ability to generate any kind of force would, most experts say we'd struggle to maintain 5,000 troops on the ground. What's happened?
Well, you know what's happened. I mean, over the last 30 years, our armed forces have been slowly but surely hollowed out.
Malcolm Rifkind was Defence Secretary between 1992 and 1995 and had to manage some of that decline.
So the Treasury, of course, wanted to make further cuts in defence expenditure. And my judgment as Defence Secretary, I was very much against that.
Why?
Because I thought we'd already gone far enough. And I remember Margaret Thatcher, subsequent, not to that time, but later when she was retired, and I had a conversation with her, she said, Malcolm, the problem with the Ministry of Defence, if you're a Defence Secretary, you've got no allies. All the other members of the Cabinet want to see cuts in defence because it will mean more for health or education or housing or other issues, and the Treasury want it because that's their job, to try and cut spending. So I was faced with the dilemma as Defence Secretary. They wanted to cut another 750 million, which then meant a lot more than it would mean today. It was a serious...
How big was the budget back then? Do you remember?
It was about 22, 23 billion, something of that order. So they wanted to cut a further 750 million. And I had no support from anyone in Cabinet to resist this. So the question then was, how do we cope with this?
Perhaps counterintuitively, the answer he came up with was to cut £1 billion instead of the requested 750 million, largely making these savings from Defence's sprawling estate of land and buildings, while protecting frontline forces. Rifkin says he struck a deal with the Treasury to keep the extra £250 million saved, which he then used to buy the UK's first cruise missiles.
And did those cuts that you were required to make, I mean, yes, it didn't hurt the front line, but subsequently, was it something you'd rather not have had to do? I mean, because we're seeing...
Yeah. Well, yes, but sometimes it's good for you to do it. No minister wants to have their department cut, but the political world is such that all cabinet ministers, including defence secretaries, know that you have to accept that you will sometimes be outvoted in cabinet and required to do things you'd rather not do. And then your task then is to minimise the damage and sometimes to draw good results from a bad start.
Well, it's slightly intimidating because everyone salutes you. Everyone calls you Secretary of State. If you have a thought and you express it, suddenly there's a document.
George Robertson was the first Labour Defence Secretary of the post-Cold War era. He then went on to become the Secretary-General of the whole of the NATO alliance. When we spoke, he took me back to 1997. Tony Blair had just defeated John Major to become Prime Minister, and Robertson was tasked with tackling defence. He's describing what it felt like to walk into the Ministry of Defence's main building on Whitehall, the one that was hit by missiles in the Wargame. As well as being intimidated, Robertson was also very quickly made aware of what will become a recurring theme: the need to fight to keep military capability despite a shortage of funds.
I had a huge problem on my desk the moment I walked into the office, when the Chief of Defence Procurement said, you have to make a decision about a nuclear submarine going into Rosyth Dockyard. It must go in. And I said, well, the Chancellor has said any big expense, and this would be a big expense, has got to wait until the Treasury have seen it. And he said, well, it's going to cost £100,000 a day to keep the submarine out of Rosyth. So I went to Gordon Brown and I said, I've got this big decision to make. And he said, well, hold it. And I said, ask me where it's going to be done. And I said, Rosyth Dockyard in your constituency. Go ahead, he said. So, but I said to the Chief of Defence Procurement, I said, so I make the decision, but there's only one decision to be made. He said, yes, Secretary of State, that's the situation. So that was my first little experience of the multiple decisions that you have to make in the jobs.
Labour inherited a defence budget that had already been reduced by about a third under the Tories. Lord Robertson then delivered his own strategic defence review, but with the same challenge of a reluctance across government to spend money on defence. He reveals just how far he and his junior defence ministers had been willing to go to fight off pressure from Blair and Gordon Brown to make even bigger cuts.
But we had committed ourselves in '97 to doing a review based on a foreign policy baseline, that it would be foreign policy driven and not Treasury led. So at the end of the process, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, my good friend Gordon Brown, said that he was going to take, at that time, quite a big chunk out of my budget. I think about I think it was about 2 billion, and the total budget at that time was about 14. So it's quite a big chunk out of it. And we complained bitterly because we had said it was foreign policy. And I don't think I've ever said this in public before, but John Reid, who was the Minister for the Armed Forces, and John Speller, who was one of the junior ministers in the department, the three of us went to see Tony Blair late at night. He was wearing a tracksuit, we always remember. And we said that if the money was taken out of our budget, the budget that was based on the foreign policy baseline, then we would have to resign. He didn't take it serious, and we said, no, absolutely, we have to resign. We gave an absolute commitment inside the Ministry of Defence to the armed forces and to the public that it would be foreign policy led, and if an arbitrary figure is going to be taken out, then we will feel obliged to resign. So we obviously didn't resign, but we kept the money.
Can you just talk about what you felt the purpose of the armed forces was at that time? Because it wasn't anymore to be able to fight a high-intensity war on the home front. Can you just talk about that? What was the evolution that you came up with?
It's power projection. Go far, hit hard, stay long. Yeah. You know, that was the strapline. And over the years, when you think about Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Sierra Leone, all of these involved short-term interventions for which our post-Cold War forces were ideally suited, but they weren't involved in high-intensity warfare because we didn't contemplate that as a possibility. It's in our mind now, but at that time we had a moat around the United Kingdom. We didn't think about homeland defence. We were a long way away from trouble, we had that moat round about us. The world has changed now quite dramatically.
Some may disagree with what he says about the armed forces having been ideally equipped to fight, in particular, the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and those certainly were not short-term interventions. But the main point here is that those who were devising defence policy at the end of the 1990s did not think the UK needed to be prepared to fight a war of national survival anymore, so the risk of scrapping much of that capability appeared minimal. And that's not an unreasonable assumption, given how expensive it is to maintain large numbers of troops, reserve forces and weapons.
Good evening. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people are feared dead beneath the rubble of New York's two tallest office blocks in the worst act of terrorism the world has witnessed. The twin World Trade Center buildings were destroyed by two hijacked airliners which flew into them and exploded.
Defence planners also, understandably, could not have predicted what would then unfold on the 11th of September 2001, when Al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the United States, fundamentally changing the focus of US and British military priorities for a generation.
The truth was 9/11 came out of the blue and out of a blue sky over New York, and no one had prepared for that.
The task of helping to lead the UK's response to the attacks fell to another senior Labour politician, Geoff Hoon, who had by then taken over as Defence Secretary from Robertson.
I realised as I was heading for the MOD for some emergency meetings that fairly soon British troops will be engaged in Afghanistan, because I knew where the threat had come from. But the reality was in Afghanistan that there were precious few targets for conventional forces to address.
A former law lecturer at Leeds University, Hoon became a member of the European Parliament in 1984 before being elected as an MP almost a decade later. His time at the Ministry of Defence from 1999 to 2005 made him the longest-serving Labour Defence Secretary since Dennis Healey in the 1960s. It also spanned a hugely controversial and consequential period that saw the UK follow the US to war in both Afghanistan and then Iraq.
Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory.
It's around this time that I started reporting on the British military as a correspondent in Baghdad. Fairly new to the defence world, I didn't fully understand the significance of what I was witnessing as British forces struggled to keep the peace in southern Iraq, where they were based following the 2003 invasion. On one trip to Basra, I remember soldiers telling me they'd dubbed the vehicles they were using mobile coffins. This was because these snatch Land Rovers lacked the armour to protect them from roadside bombs that were fast becoming a deadly hazard. On another visit, I went to a palace in the city centre that was being used as a base and was also perilous. Iraqi militants, financed and armed by next-door Iran, repeatedly targeted the site with rockets and mortars. My hosts showed me what they jokingly called a splat map, a good example of the gallows humour that kept up morale. It displayed the impact sites of the previous 24 hours, and from memory, there were dozens of dots. A big challenge for British commanders in Iraq was that they never had enough troops and kit to achieve the task they'd been given. This had a lot to do with the unpopularity of the war back home, with Tony Blair keen to draw down numbers as rapidly as possible. Yet the limited availability of resources was also a factor, especially as the UK, in 2006, surged extra soldiers to fight in Afghanistan.
When I was in Iraq, I remember being told that the Americans called the British the borrowers because they're always sort of scrounging to try to get kit because theirs either is too old or broken.
There is no doubt that it goes right through the system in terms of the resources available to British soldiers, but most notably, inevitably, when British forces are deployed overseas, because in the absence of comfortable military bases to operate in, I've seen it for myself, and I've slept in tents and so on around the world, as I'm sure you have, and the reality is that everything that you need to support your forces really has to be taken with you. You can't rely on any kind of local support or assistance, and that imposes huge challenges. I even before we went into Iraq, I remember going to Kuwait, where we had an operation over the no-fly zones in southern Iraq, and there was an American base not far from where the British were based, and the Americans had Kentucky Fried Chicken, they had a bowling alley, they had all of the support and resources that American soldiers expect when they're deployed. British soldiers had very little, I'm afraid.
The strain of deploying on two fronts unusually prompted the head of the army at the time to warn publicly that the armed forces were running hot. They were also being bent out of shape to fight what were ultimately wars of choice rather than of national survival. General Carter again.
It was all about precision systems and about intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities that could identify terrorist targets, which could then be very clinically dealt with either by something on the ground or by a missile or a bomb. The idea of massed artillery, massed air defence systems, combating massed waves of drones was not something that was in the lexicon at all. And I think that one realised at that point in time, I think pretty clearly that, the old adage being able to fight a high-intensity peer-on-peer conventional war meant you were well capable of doing everything else was not the case. It required different skills and different bits of equipment.
And so what did we lose? What did we sacrifice as we adapted at that point?
Well, I think what was also going on in parallel was that because money was always short, people became very, very obsessed with efficiency and just-in-time supply chains. So over a period of 30 years, but certainly the 15 years of the post-9/11 campaigns, we became very efficient, but we became a lot less resilient.
Deep unpopularity back in the UK of the Iraq War in particular had a profound impact on public opinion about the utility of military force, with the public no longer feeling under threat on the home front and increasingly opposed to deploying British troops to fight overseas. It became even harder for the Ministry of Defence to compete for limited funds. This was especially true following the global financial crisis of 2008. By then, there was a new man in charge at the Ministry of Defence.
What I hadn't realised going into the building was quite the extent of challenge that I was going to inherit. The money wasn't sorted. We were running quite big deficit budgets on defence.
Now a member of the House of Lords, John Hutton was Defence Secretary for less than a year between 2008 until 2009. He's describing what's often referred to as Defence's black hole. This is the gap between the cost of what the Army, Navy and Air Force want to buy in terms of things like jets, ships and tanks, and the amount of actual money in the budget. The coalition government between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats that came to power in 2010 after defeating Gordon Brown, who by then had replaced Tony Blair as Prime Minister, claimed the black hole left by Labour had been nearly £40 billion. But in this failure, everyone is guilty, as Sir Keir Starmer, the current Labour Prime Minister, now blames the Tories for in turn leaving defence in a mess.
So we had, massive commitment in Iraq and a growing and very extensive commitment in Afghanistan. And then really to realise that, there was virtually nothing left in the cupboard, that we were really short of money.
In what sense, nothing left in the cupboard? What do you mean?
Money, primarily. We were running over our budget. And the Treasury was saying, look, you need to find some savings. My own view of that is that I think there's nothing wrong with trying to find savings. I mean, in any department, you'll probably find money that you probably could spend more intelligently. The challenge in defence is that, of course, if you're going to sort of, for example, cut spending, you have to be absolutely clear. You've got a strategic analysis behind that stands up. So if you're going to lose some capability or you're going to shrink some capability, it comes with a price for Britain's security, and how are you going to sort of respond to that?
Can you just give a sense of what sort of savings were you being asked to make?
Well, several billion. It wasn't several billion in 1 year, but we were several billion over our budget. And I think the in-year savings might have been $1 billion, something like that.
Can you just take us back into the room back in 2008, 2009, when you were having discussions with the Treasury and the kind of pressure that you were being put under and the arguments that were being made to you as to why you had to make savings when, you're doing the Ministry of Defence, like it should be the primary, every government says it's like the primary function of government is the defence of the nation.
I think there were those conversations, as you said, and the Treasury were looking at the books and had worked out, as we all had, that we were spending more than we'd been given. So something had to give. And the way we dealt with that then was to sort of slip a few procurement decisions, push things back a little bit.
This is an accounting trick that the Ministry of Defence has perfected over the decades. But when you delay spending money on building something like a warship or a submarine by slowing down the programme, the total cost, once it's completed, will be higher. It will take longer to deliver, and you might have to reduce the order. So while the books may appear to balance in the short term, the taxpayer, the armed forces, and the whole country are ultimately having to spend more and often ending up with less.
I didn't want to do that, but, we had to find some way of bringing ourselves back into balance.
Do you remember on which equipment programmes that was?
Deborah, I can't really remember. I think the carriers were slipped a little bit, and that produced quite a saving. I think they might have been delayed a year or so.
He's talking about HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, the Royal Navy's £6 billion aircraft carriers. We heard about them in the Wargame as one was hit by Russian missiles.
I think we also made a similar decision on the Astutes, I think, during my time.
Now he's referring to the Navy's nuclear-powered attack submarines, the ones that were used in the Wargame to sink a Russian warship and a Russian submarine.
It's still being built. That programme should have finished quite some time ago. But yes, I do have regrets, yeah. But I think 20 years ago we were dealing with a different set of threats. And the calculation was made that some of these capabilities could be slipped because the real nature of the threat we were confronting then, of course, was ISIS and Al-Qaeda and international terrorism. In an ideal world, you don't want to make those decisions. But I did have to make those decisions. And for that reason, I understand fully, the pressure that subsequent defence secretaries were under. The politics were different then. There was a perception that, we can afford to continue to cut defence spending. And we can see the consequences of that today. But I think the real case then, in 2008-9, was, in my view, we needed a proper reset of strategic thinking.
From concentrating on conventional threats to a new focus on unconventional threats, and from armed forces that are overstretched, under-equipped, and have been deployed too often and without appropriate planning, to the most professional, most flexible modern forces in the world, fully equipped for the challenges of the future.
Technically, that reset took place a year later when David Cameron, who'd become the new Conservative Prime Minister, unveiled what he called a Strategic Defence and Security Review. In reality, though, it was regarded as more cost-cutting, presented as strategy.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter, from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.
I had made it very clear to David Cameron that there were big risks if we were to cut the defence budget by as much as had been envisioned. Of course, you find very quickly that you can't make cuts in defence very easily.
A new government meant, once again, a new Defence Secretary, and into that role stepped Liam Fox, who had been a GP before turning his attention to politics.
You may remember there was a letter that I wrote, a 2-page letter, half of which was leaked to the newspapers, setting out the implications of making these reductions.
I remember this well. The letter from Liam Fox to David Cameron warned of dire consequences to national security if the scale of planned defence cuts went through. It was leaked to Thomas Harding, a defence correspondent at The Telegraph. Unfortunately for me, I was then defence editor at The Times.
Was it you that leaked the letter?
No.
I remember it really ruined my evening because Thomas Harding very kindly called me up and said that he's got a very important splash that night. And then there it was in The Telegraph.
Well, of course, it was only part one of a 2-page letter. I think that someone wasn't able to photocopy both sides in time.
What was on the other side?
Oh, well, that would be less than responsible for me to tell you, but I think that the second side would have been the more explosive had it been on the front page of the paper.
What was published was sensational enough and highly unusual, as these kinds of rows are typically held in secret.
I remember the Times had a cartoon that said that was a picture of me standing outside a sign called the Ministry of Defiance.
Despite this defiance, the government's priority was to attempt to regain control of the UK's finances through a period of austerity. This meant Liam Fox and his military chiefs still ultimately accepted significant further cuts to the size of the Army, Navy and Air Force, with numbers of personnel slashed and warplanes, helicopters and ships axed.
George Osborne wanted the kind of a 12% cut. In the end, we fought it back down to 8%.
Field Marshal Lord David Richards was the head of the army at the time of the review and was promoted to be in charge of the whole armed forces after. He's referring to the then Chancellor. When he says SDR, he means Strategic Defence Review. And when he says CGS, he means Chief of the General Staff, which is the formal title of the head of the army.
So I fought the SDR argued against the SCR, but went along with it ultimately.
And why did you go along with it? Could you just explain
because
that?
the only alternative. I mean, we
Why
fought
did you not
hard.
resign?
Because people tell you, and it's probably right, that you are more powerful having fought hard by staying in post and reaching agreements of some kind with your political masters than a new CGS who doesn't know anybody, who is quite vulnerable. And I think there's something in it.
So it's not about ambition, like you saw the jazzy lights of Chief of the Defence Staff.
I don't know. I don't think so. I didn't know I was going to be CDS, and there were other options. In fact, I was not the MOD's selection for CDS.
But he was David Cameron's preferred choice.
I fought a good battle as CGS, and they wanted to cut us further, quite a lot further than they actually did. But we also knew that we were going to have to suffer some cuts. You live in the real world.
Crucially, he says he and others inside the Ministry of Defence had relied on assurances from Downing Street and the Treasury that the cuts would eventually be reversed. But that never really happened. Yet the Cameron government was telling the public everything was fine.
Were you comfortable with that? Or did you think that we were actually bluffing?
Well, I mean, you don't announce in the House of Commons that you don't have defence capabilities, because they'll be listening in Moscow and listening in Beijing and listening in Tehran.
Liam Fox.
But I thought that we could have been more direct about what we were having to do in the short term.
Though, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about how much you spend, it's also how you spend it. Britain still has one of the biggest defence budgets in the world. It's a fact the government often uses to deflect criticism about the state of the military. But putting a lot of money in does not guarantee you get a lot of fighting power out. Instead, the Ministry of Defence, led by mandarins and military chiefs who answer to their political masters, has managed to waste many of the billions of pounds that successive chancellors have given to defence since the end of the Cold War. And that's not just my choice of words. It's the verdict of multiple parliamentary and media reports into botched and wasteful procurements, from warplanes and tanks to radios and even light bulbs.
Okay, so I'm on the Army's Ajax armoured fighting vehicle. It's years late, but it's now operational.
The Ajax armoured fighting vehicle looks and sounds like a tank. I went for a drive-in one at the factory where they're being assembled in South Wales. But barely a fortnight after I made the visit in November, the Ministry of Defence temporarily stopped soldiers from using the vehicle while a safety investigation is carried out because of new concerns about excessive noise and vibrations. It's just the latest problem to hit this £5.5 billion programme, which is widely regarded as a good example of bad procurement. The platform is years late coming into service, almost 2/3 more expensive than the original price tag, and has damaged soldiers' hearing during previous trials. Still, it is the UK's first new armoured fighting vehicle in almost 3 decades, after previous attempts to buy such kit failed. I asked General Sir Nick Carter for his thoughts, though we did speak before the most recent challenges came to light. He once championed the Ajax vehicle as a brilliant new capability that would allow soldiers to penetrate deep into enemy territory to find and strike targets. That now seems very unwise, given the evolution of cheap attack drones designed to hunt and destroy large, expensive machines rolling around the battlefield. I mean, are you sort of absolutely devastated about that procurement?
Well, no, I mean, in fact, it wasn't. I mean, our narrative in 2015 which was this idea of it being used as a sort of medium-sized tank rather than what it was procured to be, which was a intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platform. I mean, it could do both. I think if you talk to the people who are now bringing it into service, they'll tell you it's very good. It's obviously gone through some difficult challenges.
That's a bit of an understatement.
Okay, but the problem we've got, and let's cast our mind back to the 1930s where we had a British industry, and that industry could be turned from making cars to making aeroplanes or tanks.
He's making an important point here, comparing the impressive industrial capacity of the UK in the run-up to the Second World War with now.
We don't have that any longer in this country. So trying to get people to make armoured vehicles in this country is extremely challenging. And in 2014, when my predecessor as head of the army, Peter Wall, managed to persuade the system that we should have this vehicle, it was going to be made in South Wales in a completely new factory, completely new skill sets, creating capability that the country by then had got rid of. During the 1980s, we got rid of most of our manufacturing base, which was a big problem for today when we're talking about resilience. So what you're essentially doing is you're creating something completely new. Now, yes, there are all sorts of problems with military procurement, and yes, people overspecify the requirement and turn it into something that's far too complex and everything associated with it. But it does come down to hard-nosed engineering, and ultimately we're not as good at that as we once were.
Responsibility for the UK's poor track record for buying weapons is hard to pin down.
Well, it's like Murder on the Orient Express, isn't it? Everybody did it. There isn't an individual.
Sir Bernard Gray should know. You might remember him from the Wargame. He was in our team of experts offering advice to the Prime Minister and his Cobra committee. In real life, back in 2009, Gray wrote a major report for the then Labour government on how to fix defence procurement. 2 years later, under David Cameron, he was put in charge of that whole system and tasked with implementing his recommendations. He only had limited success.
What I'm saying is there are system biases. Politicians want to order things, military leaders want more stuff. They're not looking down into the 10, 20-year time frame that about how this all plays out. They're looking at, we'll be heroes today by we stood up for our armed service, or, the Prime Minister's looks good about strengthening the armed forces. And nobody's the boring, almost person from accounts who's, Bernard's saying well, you can't have it because you can't afford it.
He says there are two fundamental problems with defence procurement. Firstly, military chiefs order more than they can afford. It means they then have to slow the building of platforms down in the hope more money will appear from the Treasury at some point in the future. But as I've said before, that kind of behaviour ultimately pushes up the total cost. Secondly, the armed forces have a terrible habit of making changes to the equipment they've ordered, and yes, that makes it more expensive as well.
There's a job title called requirements managers, which means the person who is deciding on behalf of the Army or the Navy or the Air Force what the specification for the equipment should be. And those people rotate through their job every 2 years. And the new person coming in won't know as much as the person who just left, but also will want to leave their mark on a programme. And so, one of my slightly less tasteful jokes is that requirements managers are to programmes as dogs are to lampposts. And they want to leave their mark to prove that they were there. And so they will change a programme. And every time you go in and say, I know we ordered it in blue, but we want it in pink, then the contractor will say, well, there's a variation charge for that. I bought all the blue paint and now I've got to get rid of it. And now you want me to buy another pink paint. And so costs go up. And those two sources of change, having to slow things down, having to accommodate changes in specification, cause huge cost increases and difficulties in the programme. And if you could just get a grip on those, that would make a huge difference.
Add into the mix what's known as optimism bias. The Army, Navy and Air Force, desperate for a particular weapon, warship or plane, have been known to present wildly optimistic assumptions of the price tag. They put forward a modest number that ensures their programme of choice gets approved, but then the true amount is inevitably an order of magnitude higher. A good example of all this is the Royal Navy's 2 aircraft carriers, which were included in George Robertson's 1998 Defence Review, though they only entered into service around 2 decades later. Rows about these ships, and the even more expensive F-35 fighter jets that fly off them, dominated UK defence procurement during that time, with supporters and critics, respectively, trying to save or kill the programme.
I love the Navy dearly, but we could have had another 5 frigates and destroyers for one carrier. And David Cameron got very near to cancelling the programme. But I said to him, I don't think you will, though to be fair, he nearly did.
Field Marshal David Richards again, talking about his time as head of the armed forces and the advice he gave the then Prime Minister.
I coached him a little bit in what he had to save. And,
really? And what?
Yeah. I said, these things are old speak. They're not going to be any good in future state-on-state wars. I said they might be of value
Floating
in
targets.
Libya or Sierra Leone, but you don't spend billions on ships that you can only use.
But weren't they too expensive to cancel? Wasn't that what Gordon Brown
That was
said?
a problem. So you've answered my question. Basically, economically and politically, it was too much for them.
But how big a blow is that how big a blow was the carrier decision to our current state of hollowed out forces? Do you think we'd be more military capable if we had listened to what you were saying back then?
Well, it depends on whether you are a fanatic about carrier power. I think most people now say that they would not be investing in them today. And it has undoubtedly impacted on the size of the Royal Air Force, for example. And where I am a great believer in maritime power, but I think carriers are probably now dated capability for the reasons we've talked about.
The Chinese Navy, the Chinese are building more and more of them.
More fool them.
The Royal Navy and Bernard Gray would strongly disagree.
I think that they are very capable ships, and they are large, significantly larger than they were supposed to be. So we commissioned a 40,000-ton ship. It turned out to be 65,000 tons by the time it was built. But what that does give us is ships that will last 50 years, which we can do quite a lot of things with.
So long as they're not sunk by drones, because they don't have great air defences, do they?
Sinking a 65,000-ton object is harder than you think, right? So if you fire at it from a submarine, you can fire a very heavy torpedo, and you probably need to fire 3 or 4.
An aircraft carrier is effectively a floating airfield that enables a country to launch its warplanes against targets anywhere in the world. But it's not just about the ship. A military needs jets to fly off its carrier and a flotilla of escort vessels, including frigates, a destroyer and support ships carrying things like fuel and ammunition, to deploy with it. If, like the UK, you can't do all of that, but still procure carriers anyway, you risk hollowing out the rest of your forces for the sake of an exquisite piece of kit that you can't really afford to lose. The Royal Navy would also struggle to deploy one of its carriers without help from allies because of a shortage of British warships and crews. David Richards shared his concerns about the programme with Bernard Gray when Gray became the head of the MOD's Defence Equipment and Support in 2011.
The then Chief of Defence Staff, Lord Richards, as he now is, came along to me and he said, we're really worried that the cost of the aircraft carrier programme is like a cuckoo in the nest, and it's going to kick all other programmes out. It's just ballooning and we can't afford to do anything else. So could you take a look at it for me and see what the state of play is?
As a defence journalist, the next part of this story has always stuck in my mind because it's so bonkers and so wasteful. It's also a bit nerdy, but bear with me. A big point of friction with the carrier strike force centred on the type of F-35 aircraft that the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force wanted. Britain initially opted for the B variant of the jet, which can take off from a short runway on a ship and land vertically. But some inside Defence really wanted the C model. This version is catapulted off the deck of a ship, can fly much further, and carries more weapons. David Cameron's coalition government was also a fan. It decided to flip the original decision as part of its defence review in 2010, saying the UK now wanted the F-35C. But because the cost would have to rise, the government said it would mothball one of its 2 new carriers. Hardly value for money.
So I quickly realised that we had, for whatever reason, procured 2 aircraft carriers that were neither fish nor fowl.
Into this mess stepped Philip Hammond, who had a treasury rather than a defence background.
And I have no doubt that part of the reason I was put into that role when the vacancy arose was because the Treasury wanted someone in there that it felt had an understanding of the Treasury perspective on defence matters. And I think for that reason I was probably regarded with a deal of suspicion by the military brass when I arrived in main building.
Well, do you remember the nickname that you got?
Oh, or maybe I didn't even know it. You tell me.
Forensic Phil?
Okay, I didn't know that.
It was like Forensic Phil, because that was
I'll take that as a compliment.
A former shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, he took over very suddenly as Defence Secretary in 2011 after Liam Fox resigned amid pressure about his professional relationship with a friend and unofficial advisor. Hammond was considered to be more comfortable with spreadsheets than soldiering, but I remember going out on a patrol with him in southern Afghanistan. Hammond, in his body armour, was up for exiting the relative safety of a base in Helmand Province and walking to a local police station, a risky move for someone so high profile. Tackling the aircraft carrier debacle back home also required strong nerves. By then, Bernard Gray had discovered the decision a year earlier in the Defence Review to flip to the F-35C from the B had been made on the back of a call by the Cabinet Office on a Friday afternoon to the Defence Equipment and Support Team, asking for a quote for the cost to adapt the carriers to accommodate the change.
So there's a serious adaptation of a serious piece of equipment that's been 10 years in the planning. We want an answer in 3 or 4 hours on a Friday. Never the best time to ask government for anything.
The defence team had come back with an estimate to convert the Prince of Wales carrier. It was between £750 million and £1 billion.
This then, through the magic of government, gets translated into a number that says it's 750 million, not a range, but the low number.
Gray decided to check the costing of the conversion again with the team. The number had grown to £1.75 billion.
So, say, what we're actually proposing to do here is pay $6 billion to build 2 carriers, throw one of them away, and then spend another $2 billion converting this second carrier into one with catapults on it, and therefore we will have spent $8 billion and have 1 ship. And
what was the reaction?
Well, jaws fell a bit, I think.
Bernard Gray and David Richards felt the only sensible, albeit uncomfortable option was for the government to ditch the F-35C idea and perform an unglamorous double U-turn to switch back to the original plan of the F-35B jets and 2 carriers. This would mean the UK ending up with ships armed with planes that can't fly as far or carry as many weapons as the other model, but at least the programme wouldn't further hollow out defence. They broke the news to Hammond, who then had to tell the Prime Minister.
It wasn't an easy conversation with David Cameron, as you can imagine. But
did you have to have that conversation?
I did, yes.
How did it go?
Well, it was difficult, and David was sceptical, but actually David Cameron was always persuadable by facts. And once he understood that the information on which he'd made the original decision could not be relied upon, he was open to revisiting that.
So far, we've heard a lot of evidence of bad decisions by the military and their political masters that's wasted money and time. But there is another unavoidable challenge in defence procurement. It comes in the form of the big defence companies that are needed to make the kit. These commercial entities are skilled at negotiating contracts with the Ministry of Defence on terms that benefit them and their shareholders. This is hardly surprising, given their businesses, not charities, and the contracts are for things like warships and submarines that can't just be made by anyone. Importantly, defence contractors also create jobs and wealth for the economy, while the government needs the British defence industry to thrive, so the UK maintains what's known as a sovereign capability to build certain weapons. Yet these transactions between the MOD and the private sector have not always delivered value for money for the taxpayer. In 2003, the companies BAE Systems, Babcock and Thales, together with the Ministry of Defence, formed the Aircraft Carrier Alliance to build the warships under what Bernard Gray claims was initially a very good deal for the contractors.
What are we aiming to build the carriers for was at 5.4 billion, with a hope that they would get it down to 5.2. But that for every pound over 5.4 billion, the contractors only lost 10p of profit per pound of cost overrun.
What Gray is saying is that if the programme ended up costing more than expected, the contractors would only be liable for a mere 10% of the increase, while the rest would be covered by the MOD.
And that only meant that their profit would get eliminated. They would never lose money on it, in the way the contract was written.
The Ministry of Defence also suspected the actual cost would be more like £6 billion, not 5.4 billion, so Gray attempted to renegotiate the deal. It wasn't a popular move.
I was invited to what I'd call a punishment dinner, where we were fed fish and chips around at one of the main contractors' offices, and I was sort of lectured for a couple of hours on why I was wrong in saying the aircraft carriers were going to cost 6 billion. They were arguing that they were going to get it done for 5.4 or 5.2. And
isn't that a good thing?
Well, it is if you do it. I mean, I'd like to be 11 stone, and I'm promising to do it today. Whether I achieve that or not is a whole separate question.
So he says he decided to call the company's bluff by offering them a higher price to make the ships, but on a fixed-term basis. That means the contractors would be liable for any cost overruns.
So I actually said in this meeting, OK, I'll give you £5.8 billion right now. I'll give you a fixed price contract for 5. If you swear blind you're going to do it for 5.4, I don't have any authority for it, but I bet I can get Philip Hammond to sign it, to say you build the aircraft carriers for a fixed price of 5.8 billion. And then I get told, well, I'm just being ridiculous. This is absurd. It's not how you do things. So I said, well, how can you be so confident that you're going to do it 5.4? You're turning away £400 million worth of extra profit. If you really believe what you're saying, if you really, really believe it, you'd by biting my hand off. And, what that says to me is you don't believe it. And so they go away. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, do a proper cost estimate and tell me what price you would charge for a fixed price to deliver the aircraft carrier. Want to know what that number is?
Go on, tell me.
£6.8 billion. So they sit there swearing blind they're going to do it for 5.4, but if you actually want them to take the risk, then it's £6.8 billion.
Wow.
Right.
Bernard Gray and Philip Hammond discussed the new figure and responded with a compromise counteroffer of £6.2 billion.
It was very stressful.
Philip Hammond.
And it was the most hands-on thing I ever did in the Ministry of Defence. We actually sat in the room with the contractors. I sat in the room with the contractors, and we negotiated directly face-to-face. And then Bernard would take their team of experts off into another room, and they'd spend a few hours, and then I would come back into the room, and we told them this is stopping now. We're not carrying on with this programme unless we can agree an arrangement which works for all of us. Has to work for them as well.
In the end, a deal was struck that meant both sides carried a fairer share of the risk.
We ended up with a 50-50 pain share, gain share contract, rescoped, respecified and repriced, but on a 50-50 pain share, gain share. And as far as I'm aware, for the core project, there have been some subsequent revisions to the project, but for the core project, on that basis, it broadly delivered on budget because both parties had equal skin in the game in finding solutions to cost drivers.
Trying to make the military live within its means was a hallmark of the Hammond era, though this meant prioritising what was affordable over what was needed. And that was not a popular approach within defence. Coming up in the final episode of The Wargame, tensions grow between the Ministry of Defence and the Treasury as the threat from Russia returns.
Gavin Williamson came in. The military polished up their bleeding stumps as best they could and convinced him that the UK's defence capability was about to collapse. And he came scuttling across the road to Downing Street to say, I need, billions of pounds more money.
There was this sort of sense of, the MOD is always good for $1 billion from Treasury. You can always take $1 billion out of the MOD and nothing will really change. And maybe that had been the case in the past, but the cupboards were really bare. You were just taking the cupboards.
The Wargame was written and presented by me, Deborah Haynes. The series producer is James Shield. Episode production by Matt Russell. The development producer is Jess Swinburne. Original music and sound design are by Tom Kinsella. Additional production by Katie Scholes. The editor for Tortoise is Jasper Corbett. For Sky News, the commissioning editor is Paul Stanworth, and the executive producers are Sarah Whitehead and David Mapstone.
Okay, there's a lot of firing going on.
3 minutes, you need to go from here.
Okay.
Unless you want to be arrested.
Can you explain to me why? We're journalists, sir.
If you weren't affected, you'd be a bit of a strange person.
That is what it's like. Sometimes you have to put in an awful lot of hard work. It's worth doing. I suppose it is what we do.
Feel the heat of the front line with Alex Crawford, Stuart Ramsey and their teams in the new series of Hotspots. Just search Sky News Hotspots on YouTube to subscribe.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.